My fault, everybody. I messed up that intro real quick. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to another episode of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Um, really excited to do this conversation again with Dr. Orisanmi Burton. He is a professor of anthropology. As a social anthropologist, his research examines the imbrication of grassroots resistance and state repression, which is exactly what we'll be talking about today. If you have not read his book, Tip of the Spear, you have to do so. Um, I'm gonna just welcome him to the stage so that we can get into this. Of course, do the basic things, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Support us on Patreon if you're able to, and of course, share this conversation with others. I, really look forward to this. Um, we've been talking about this for a while, and obviously we had part one, which was great, and looking forward to kind of concluding our discussion of Frank Kitson and low intensity operation. So Orisanmi, welcome to the stage. It's good to be with you.
Peace. Thanks for having me back. Always a pleasure.
Always. Yeah, no, this is great. And my earpiece keeps falling out and I push it, which is what happened during the intro, by the way. That's why it paused, and so anyway, and I couldn't figure out how to unpause it. So today we're going to talk about basically parts 2 and 3 of this book, which is the conclusion, and then we're going to bring in some other pieces to kind of discuss some of it, because honestly there's a lot in these sections that is really just not that interesting, or there's a lot of fluff in this book that could have been left out. There's also these scenarios, which I think are interesting. I mean, I think one of the things that people could do is just read counterinsurgency literature just for the scenarios. There's always a lot of them. Even in the counterinsurgency field manual, there's ones. They're always like really summarized. They're always from a very specific, imperialist, military kind of point of view. They're devoid of, they paper over and lie. Like, is it, this discussion of lying, there's a lot of lying, there's a lot of like, well, this is what happens, we were helping these people and these people were, and it's just when you actually study the struggles that they're talking about, they're just lying, basically. And part of it is their perspective, and what they see as their role and how they understand what's going on. But but nonetheless, it's like interesting because it's one of the spaces where you actually get them talking about, like, these are the strategies and tactics that we use to try to suppress this. Now, as we'll get into, again, some of that is a lie, or it's like it's elevating certain tactics as like this was this great, amazing innovation that we had that allowed us to be successful, when in reality what made them successful was the level of sheer brutality, the willingness to do things that nobody would say, like, oh, that's okay to do, to sort of go beyond any boundaries, right, of what war is supposed to fall into, which, again, like, as we're thinking about things like Gaza or Yemen or whatever, like, this is where we could see real connections, actually, I think, to this kind of work. But folks like Kitson, they want to put a veneer of, like, we're doing something sophisticated and kind of humane, and it's really not that. So I
Not
don't know
at
if there's
all.
anything else you want to say up front, before we kind of get into this section.
No, just, whenever I encounter these scenarios, always wondering, like, on the one hand, I agree with you. On the other hand, I'm like, we need some scenarios. Like, where are our scenarios? That's a useful exercise, to be that organized and to engage in that level of long-term planning, in a rigorously, sort of pragmatic way, to say, look, if this happens, these are our capacities, this is what we can do if this happens. So I think it might also be useful just to look at those and think about, okay, well, what would our scenario planning look like? given where we are. And then the thing about the lying, I meant to bring this up last time, but Carolyn Elkins, do I sound okay? Does it sound all right? Yeah, Carolyn Elkins, a historian at Harvard, she wrote Imperial, what's it called? She wrote a couple books on the Mau Mau. But she also wrote an article on her methodology of studying the Mau Mau and the counterinsurgency against them. And it begins with the colonial archive on fire. So in other words, when the British left Kenya, they set all the records on fire. Do you know what I mean? So in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of papering over the level of brutality and sort of re-narrating counterinsurgency as this sort of genteel, form of intelligent warfare, as Kitson likes to call it, is facilitated by the process of just like destroying the material record of what happened, to say nothing of the people. I mean, there are survivors, but not many. So yeah, that's all. Just that actually records management, destroying knowledge is actually, and this is a part of counterinsurgency that he doesn't talk about.
Yeah, I saw something recently, and I don't want to misspeak on it, but there was something with one of the federal agencies that that Trump was, in the process of defunding or like severely downsizing or whatever, where there was, something along the line of like employees saying they were being sent in to like either shred or burn, records, and I was just thinking like, yeah, that's the whole thing about, all that work, which people often don't know about, was very interesting, is like in the 70s of when, there were these kind of congressional hearings about the CIA and its activities that were sparked by the realization that they were doing stuff in the United States as well. And, as that they claim that they destroyed like everything on several of the programs at least. And of course, it's not totally true. And then there's like copies certain places, but it makes it very difficult then to actually trace down like what actually happened. Cause then you just have the word of, whatever CIA spokesperson is going to speak or whatever, so anyway.
Yep.
So chapter 4, so he gets into, I'm just going to kind of draw a sketch here for folks, and we can talk about any of this that you want to kind of, but he talks about a preparatory period. So one of the things that we talked about this a little bit last time of like, basically going after these groups before they become insurgent, right? And so this is again the point that we were making last time of, that he draws out of before a group actually becomes a threat, or before it becomes an insurgency, before movements move to a space where they're starting to be tighter around their security and who can and can't be in spaces. So the time of mass movements and so on, that Kitson argues like this is the space where you need to infiltrate. This is the space where you need to gather information. Obviously, he argues that all along, but he sees it as an opportunity, and so that's kind of what that section is. He talks. He has this.
It's even worse than that, though, right? Because chapters 4 and 5. So chapter 4 is the preparatory period. Chapter 5 is the nonviolent phase. So insurgency is subversive activity that includes the use of violence. We covered that last time, right? So the nonviolent phase is not insurgency, right? That's what you were just saying, right? So chapter 5 is the nonviolent phase, when you're trying to disrupt a movement that is ostensibly engaged in nonviolent action. So the chapter preceding that is about what you do even before that. So it's really about how you destroy a movement before it even becomes an organization, right? It's like, how do you disrupt a movement in the pre-organizational phase? You know what I mean? So I just think that that's important to understand, that in terms of part 2, the first 2 chapters are about how to how to destroy movements from forming even before they become organizations.
Yeah, and we could talk about the nonprofit industrial complex as maybe the most sophisticated form of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think it is one of these spaces too where like Kitson has these aspirations in this book that are also just like grander than what they can do, what they can accomplish. You know
For
what I
sure.
mean?
And it's important
And,
that we always emphasize that. Yeah.
yeah. And then he has this section where he talks about the communication and command structure, which is like not that important. I don't think it's just sort of like he's advocating for the army basically to be kind of always in charge and overseeing everything in a foreign and domestic sphere, basically. And he does talk about why that's complicated and why most places that won't actually happen, and the difficulties of communicating across different agencies. And he gets into the big, I mean, intelligence is a huge aspect of this, of his thinking in general. Like he's really advocating for a centralized intelligence, a central intelligence agency, one might say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And advocating for that also, of like you're a lot knowing that you're doing counterinsurgency often in other outside of your outside of the UK, right, to use his context. He's also talking about the difficulties and the challenges of doing it in Kenya or Malaya or the Philippines or whatever, and interfacing with the different local police. How does that go, and all that kind of stuff. And so
For
there is that
sure.
piece.
But also, like he says multiple times that he thinks the most important wars of subversion in the near future, that is like throughout the 70s and 80s, is going to be in the imperial core. So he's talking about what's happening in the imperial core, or what might happen. And so the idea that he's making an argument for the military to be fully integrated into all areas of civil society is extremely important. It's extremely important. And so the reason why it poses a problem is because the places that he's talking about are ostensibly democracies. And so this gets to the question you're always raising about, this kind of authoritarianism that's like just beneath the surface of this whole process, right? And there's something that's really interesting on the first page of chapter 4. He's talking about, again, how to disrupt. He's talking about how to disrupt the enemy before the start of the campaign and before the organization's been fully built. But he says, in practice, this is difficult to achieve because for a long time, the government may be unaware that a significant threat exists. And in any case, in a so-called free country, it is regarded as the opposite of freedom to restrict the spread of a political idea. And I just think, it's interesting to see when and how certain kinds of actors use the phrase so-called as a way to indicate that what is being discussed is not really the thing, So he's saying in a so-called free country. So, and he's talking about the West. So he's highly skeptical, it seems, maybe I'm reading it wrong, that that these are actually free countries, right? And this, again, I think speaks to the sort of authoritarianism inherent in his political ideology, but also inherent in the Western democracies that he's talking about.
Yeah, let's go from there to his like discussion on the judicial system too, because this is a really connected point.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just read this. He
Yep.
says, having got the machinery established, this is like the machinery of counterinsurgency, basically. The next task for the military leadership is to present to the Supreme Council a number of issues, a joint military civilian nature on which firm policy rulings should be taken before operations against those practicing subversion can start. Right. So again, this is before you're doing nonviolent resistance, right?
Do you want to put it up so people can read along?
Yeah. That's a good idea. I will. Hang on. All right. All right, is it there yet? Okay.
Yeah, I can see it.
All right. So an excellent example concerns the way in which the law should work. Broadly speaking, there are two possible alternatives. The first one being that the law should be used as just another weapon in the government's arsenal. And in this case, it becomes a little more than a propaganda cover for the disposal of unwanted members of the public. For this to happen efficiently, the activities of the legal services have to be tied into the war effort in as discreet a way as possible, which in effect means that the member of the government responsible for the law either sits on the Supreme Council or takes his orders from the head of the administration. The other alternative is that the law should remain impartial and administer the laws of the country without any direction from the government. Naturally, the government can introduce new legislation to deal with the subversion, which can be very tough if necessary. And once this becomes law, the legal services will administer justice based on it. But the resulting situation is very different from that described in the first alternative, because in the second case, the officers of the law will recognize no difference between the forces of the government, the enemy, or the uncommitted part of the population. Any violation of the law will be treated in the same way. I'll stop there, but the point just being that these are two paths, and we see both of these paths. We could talk about them in this current moment even. But, on the one hand, this idea that you're going to treat everybody just according to the law, like this was the United States approach largely within its own counterinsurgencies against like the Black liberation movement, right? Is to say these people are criminals. They have broken our criminal laws, and therefore they'll be tried and kept as such. They're not political prisoners, right? Whereas on the flip side, what he's arguing is like basically directly just attack, going after and eliminating and capturing the insurgents, right? Just under a sort of war pretext is the way I read it, which would be more like, for instance, what you could say Israel's, doing with Palestine, of saying like these people that we're capturing, they're Hamas, right? And so that's why and this has implications. I mean, in Northern Ireland, which is one of the places that he's thinking about, is in a time where actually prisoners lose their political prison status and then go on a struggle to regain it. But it's also like, there's a fascinating parallel to right now where Trump is using these war powers to deport Venezuelans to El Salvador, for instance, right? With no real criminal pretext to it.
Yeah, I mean, these are like Weberian ideal types. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think he really believes this. He's got law capitalized, first of all. So it's like a theoretical construct for him. It's not like an actual thing. I mean, it's very clear that, and so the other thing, because he goes on to talk about like he mentions it briefly, states of emergency. So a state of emergency, I think, was declared in every counterinsurgency that he was a part of, that's the propaganda cover to then use law as a weapon and still claim that it's a democracy in which law is equal, right? So it's the assertion that there are extenuating circumstances and that this is a democracy, but we're under this extreme condition. And so we have to suspend some of the regulations in order to target this existential threat. But, I think he's right in the sense of this is how it plays out in a theoretical debate about law. But in practice, law is always used as an instrument for the ruling class under capitalism. Like, that's how it works. But I'm saying he knows that. He knows it.
And he's kind of saying it there too. Like, yeah. I cut the quote off a little short, but like he is sort of saying like, look, these are the two options of how we use the law to target these folks. And the one that's the second one, you know, even though I think it is sort of like closer to like the United States model in the late 60s and 70s, you know, in terms of targeting revolutionaries, that what he's saying is it presents this veneer to some extent because you don't have to use the wartime power. You don't have to declare the state of emergency, right? You can still use it and you make yourself look like more of a democracy.
Right. That's what he's
You
saying.
know, but
Yes.
yeah, it for him, he's all of these scenarios that he puts, it's basically perception that he's most interested in,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's
Exactly.
like, you know, yeah. All right. So then he goes into he does have a section where he summarizes some of the methods, you know, that he sees within his kind of counterinsurgency approach. One is just intelligence gathering. He talks about operational and political intelligence, and then later he'll talk about how you develop background intelligence background information into contact information, which we'll get into, I'm sure, a little bit more. The short answer on how you do it is that you torture people, but there's more to it than that too. And then psyops and propaganda. So this is a big emphasis in this book, and in the back half of this book is why the government needs to commit a lot more resources to psyops, basically. And then the process of counter-organization, which I know we'll talk about more as well. You know, this is where you get the counter gangs and the pseudo gangs, you know, strategies, which he talks about both in this book and in Counter Gangs. But he's also, it's not, I would say the counter organization is a little bit broader than that, wouldn't you? Because it's not just like the counter gangs is more like Contras or death squads or like or a mixture of that with like a kind of psyop, right? Of trying to create confusion and so on. Whereas counter organization could be could also include a lot of so-called civilian strategies to kind of outmaneuver and outflank different organizations.
Yeah, I mean, so on page 79, he talks about counter organization. I would say that I don't know. I wonder, you know, yeah, they're related. I'm wondering if a counter gang is a subset of this broader. I think that's what you were also just implying, right? He says counter organization, a method by which the government can build up its control of the population and frustrate the enemy's efforts at doing so. In its simplest form, counter organization involves putting the government's views over to the population by action rather than by propaganda. That is a false distinction. For this purpose, individuals can be sent amongst the community for the purpose of doing work which will help to remove sources of grievance and at the same time making contact with the people. The sort of jobs which can be undertaken range from teaching to the setting up of clinics, advising on simple construction works, and working on agricultural projects. Later on, he talks about the importance early on of identifying suitable candidates. Oh, here's what he says. Nonetheless, the British Army could well afford to study the problems involved and have suitable men earmarked to take part in an operation of this sort. In other words, identifying potential collaborators in advance so that once it becomes clear that counter organization is necessary, that you already have those folks. And he talks about it as a process of getting under the skin of the population. Getting under the skin of the population. So it's about recognizing that people are going to press for the things they want and building an infrastructure that gives them pathways to get involved. This is where our conversation ended last time. Building infrastructures for them to get involved in ways that sort of channel their activity back into the re-legitimation of the dominant regime.
Yeah, and I think this is where, to me, like nonprofits become such a problematic thing. But it's also, if folks didn't check out the conversation we had with Mark Neoclis earlier this week, like we talked about this a little bit too, and there's a lot of, this is like a whole, I almost say it's a dominant thrust, but it's like a big arc of counterinsurgency literature of, you know, of building, of doing, you know, progressive things, of meeting the needs, or, you know, trying to understand the grievances of a population in order to address them, or, you know, and it's again, these are lies, but they want to do certain projects to create the appearance that they're doing these things, right? So it's like, and it also becomes an information gathering expedition for these folks, you know, which is also why, you know, nonprofits have to submit grant reports, and you know, I mean, there's, yeah, so anyways,
I don't know if I think that that idea is necessarily a lie. I think we got to think more expansively about what we mean by needs, and what they mean by needs. And I think, of course, all of this is happening within an overarching context of torture, terror, fear. And so certain pathways for resistance appear to be out of reach, outside the scope of what's possible, because of the sort of like the massive public violence that will be the response for people who make certain kinds of demands. And then you, on the other hand, you have this social engineering project where they're trying to encourage people to need certain kinds of things, like shape what it is that we desire. So it is a way of kind of meeting people's needs, but it's also a way of like shaping their needs and then meeting them. The lie part of it is that it's oriented towards like genuine benevolence, or like the improvement of the human condition, or the, you know, whatever, making people's lives more livable and more complete and fuller. Like that's the lie.
100%.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
what I wanted to say is, it's like the idea that they're actually trying to address the needs in such a way that the needs like are actually met on a full, you know what I mean? Like they want to, it's like if you think about, and this is to get a little bit outside of like an active counterinsurgency context, but again, this book is telling us that like he's talking about these things even when there's not an
this
insurgency
is
going
social life for
on.
him. This is just social
Yeah.
life. This is how he sees
Yeah.
social life. Yeah.
Yeah, is that if you think about, like, for instance, nonprofits that do some level of provisioning to people, like it's usually to fill in for state capacity that has been totally eviscerated, right? So it's like, you know, rather than ensuring that everyone has food, you send them to a space where they can get food, but then they have to give you all kinds of information about themselves in order to get it, right? And then you know, and then if we think about this within the context of like a heightened you know, insurgency or counterinsurgency campaign, like if we think about Gaza in this way, right? It's like you stop all food from being able to get in there, and then you limit the amount of aid that can get in, and then you know, shoot at people who are in bread lines or whatever, and then you know, try to recruit you know, informants from these, you know, these kinds of things, which is like what he really, you know, in Kenya, that's like more what that was going on, is like we will put these folks in villages, we
Yeah.
will
Concentration camps. Yep.
concentration camps, right? We will not allow food in, and then we will torture folks, and we will allow them to get food from us under, you know, our own under our terms, basically. And so I guess what I'd say is like there's kind of a sliding scale of this, of like how it looks in a under non-insurgent conditions or low-level insurgent conditions versus like most of the campaigns he's talking about where you actually had a revolutionary war or an armed struggle taking place, and how they would administer them in those circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciated the conversation you had with Mark Neoclaus. And the emphasis on these projects fundamentally about being about maintaining a generalized condition of exploitability under capitalism amongst the whole population is really important, and framing this within the longer genealogy of pacification. And just thinking about etymologically, like that word pacification, it's peace. The word means how to produce peace, but it's peace it's peace under these conditions of exploitation, right? So meeting the needs is like, okay, let's give them something so that they're quiet, so that we can maintain this overall structure. So yeah, but I think it's important to emphasize that, because there's just this twisted logic of there is a truth in there, but it's a truth that speaks to this overall twisted logic of how all of this is just about manipulating people so that you can maintain power over them, because fundamentally you think that you're more worthy of being in charge and ruling over others. So it's a very twisted morality, and I think we just have to always. I mean, I think we're talking about the same thing. So yeah.
100%. And I think it's like, I like what Neoclaus says about like the they don't want civil war, they don't want class war, they don't want revolutionary war, but they want endless social wars, which means they want their wars upon enemies that they're constantly identifying, and they see that as the means. So it's really their peace, right? It's the peace of the ruling class that is the objective, but they have no problem with warfare. So yeah, the pacification thing is interesting that way. Another thing, that I think is worth saying, and it shouldn't be surprising, I guess, since this is within like these kind of military manuals, but there's like such a clear logic of elimination within this book of, the enemies. The only question for this book is really how to find the enemies.
That's it.
It's not a question of what to do with them.
Nope.
Like they'll be captured, they'll be killed, or they'll be killed or incapacitated or neutralized, right, in some way. But he has no issue, and even in the modern counterinsurgency literature, they really don't. I mean, there are some questions around how much killing to do because of how killing is perceived, but there's no question of any kind of ethical consideration around killing, basically, and I think that's just, it's like beneath the surface, but it just shows up again and again in the times when he's just like, we have to eliminate the enemy. We have, and it's just like, he'll use that type of language when referencing the enemy. And one, it's just, it's the naming that there is an enemy. It's not that there's a portion of the population that you need to, there is a portion of the population you need to persuade, but he's not at all interested.
That's not the enemy. That's not the enemy.
The enemy is just the enemy.
The enemy cannot be. Yeah, they are like categorically the enemy, and they have to be destroyed. Yep. And all the later sections on insurgency, that's why most of it's on intelligence, because what you do with them is, it's not even something that you need to talk about. It's like you can do. It's whatever. It's so yeah. 100%. He talks about this in this chapter 4, and this is, I cited some of this in Tip of the Spear. A further example of an issue of this sort, this is page 70, concerns the extent to which force should be used either by the police or by the army. In this case, the politicians will rightly want to avoid the use of force as far as possible and for as long as possible because of the adverse effect it is bound to have on public opinion in the world at large and at home. At the same time, where there are military difficulties about the use of about using too little force and about delaying its application for too long, and these difficulties, which are fully discussed in the next chapter, must be presented to the political leadership by the military authorities after consultation with the other parties concerned, particularly the police. Again, the military is everywhere in this, right? In an advisory, ostensibly in an advisory role. And he mentions this in on page 68. You don't have to bring it up because it's a brief quote, but he says, representatives of the armed forces should be brought into the business from the very beginning. There is no danger of political repercussions to this course of action because consultation can be carried out in strictest secrecy, right? So he's aware that this is something that people won't want to happen. He's aware that it's, probably against law or decorum or protocol, but he's like, do it anyway, keep it a secret, and it won't cause a big problem because no one will know about it, right? But he's talking about the pervasiveness of the military throughout, liberal democratic governance, and the intervention and the intervention of the military in instances where there's no law breaking happening. There's no law breaking happening in this phase. It's just people holding meetings, writing articles, trying to build organizations. And he says the military needs to be present in that, identifying who these people are, making lists, developing informants, because all of this is war.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's one of the things that there are a number of ways that this book caused controversy. And that was one of them for sure, is that especially in that period, suggesting that the military needed to be directing, campaigns to counter, peaceful protest and so on within, the imperial core, it was frowned upon. And so people didn't like it. And, one of the things, I'll just say this to folks, Jay Sakai has a book called The Shape of Things to Come, which is like a collection of his interviews over the years and his, some of his writings over the years. I know he's a somewhat controversial figure himself, but I think that he's I really find his writing to be fascinating. And he has a whole section, a whole sort of essay called Counter-Gangs, which is really good. One, it has a great discussion of, the Kenyan revolutionary period, the so-called Mau Mau, emergency, and what actually was going on, how the counterinsurgency actually took place, which is much different than what Kitson describes. And I forgot what I was going to go. It was connected to the point you just raised, and I just lost it on that tangent. But anyway, we'll probably come back to it, but I do encourage folks to check that out too for some examination of Kitson. Oh, I remember what it was. So he talks about how there's the revelation, which we'll probably get to this a little bit later, but he says counter gangs are operating in the United States, or that there's evidence that they're operating in the United States as radical Black nationalist organizations, basically.
Oh yeah, that's gonna be one of my tangents for sure. We're gonna get into that.
Yeah, so we'll bracket that. But anyway, Sakai just said, like, this, in his view, this is what one of the things that pissed people off the most, is that he was revealing something that he knew because he was in those conversations with the various actors in the Rand Corporation and so on, and he was close friends with military Pentagon officials in the United States, and he knew that was occurring, and he instead passes it off that, some professor, I think it's one of the guys you referenced last time, you're muted, by the way, and Sakai's like, that's just the lightest of cover. Like, he knows this because of the military relationships that he has, and he's trying to slough it off on this, on this low level academic. This is how Sakai, sort of characterizes it. But he's like, this is part of why Kitson, was removed from Northern Ireland and so on as well, is like that the ruling class got pissed at him for writing this book and for some of the things that he includes in here. Sakai also thinks there's things that he includes in here that are just totally Kitson's self-aggrandizement and imagination and aspiration, and we shouldn't take it seriously. But he does think that for instance, revelation that counter gangs were being used in the United States was real and was based on, kind of his own relationships that he had with other counterinsurgents in the US.
No, I think that's true, but I also think it's just a modus operandi of imperial rule. So like if you're operating at that level, you probably don't even need a whole lot of personal relationships to understand that that's just how things work. Do you know what I mean? But I think that's true.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sakai's point is like, he's at these conferences with these folks where they're talking about their own counterinsurgency operations and exchanging ideas and stuff like that. And so what he is saying is like, there's no need for him to speculate on this. And yet he drops it in this as like this speculative thing of like, there's evidence that these are operating or something along those lines, rather than just, this is going on over here. Anyway, let's see. So
should we go into that? I mean, we can go there now if you want
to. There's a couple other, let's move through a few things and then we'll get to that, because I think that's kind of going to be the bulk of it once we move past this next phase. So one thing that he says is that lots of low-grade intelligence is better than a little bit of high-grade intelligence. This was kind of interesting. He's like just advocating that, there's a lot of people at the time that want a few high-level informants, basically. And his argument is that it's better to have as much information as possible, even if a lot of it's not very good. Because you can develop that information basically. And, so anyways, it's just like an argument for the mass collection of data, which I know
100%, 100%. And so, in the counterinsurgency report, the symposium that we'll talk more about later, the Rand Corporation one from 1962, he says, for a comprehensive intelligence system in counter-guerrilla warfare, then you must not only have the information collected by the Special Forces organization with its few experienced and reliable agents who might penetrate even the enemy high command, but also the mass of low-level data provided by large numbers of low-grade sources. Many of these will be unreliable, but all of them together can furnish the mosaic in which the patterns of enemy activities become discernible. So his whole thing was, not focusing on the high level, not that it's not important, but like really understanding that both of those things are important and figuring out how to integrate them into a comprehensive intelligence system. And this actually is quite interesting because I hope you don't mind me skipping ahead. In chapter 7, which is Insurgency Part 2, Direction, Units, and Equipment, page 143, he talks about what becomes the internet. And he's like, because he's plugged into this, right? So, and one of the things he does in Northern Ireland is start to use, he uses computers quite aggressively in Northern Ireland. And this is the moment when, like, this is the early prehistory of the internet, like the ARPANET, and sort of like they're calling them data banks or whatever. On page 142nd, he says, he's talking about all the equipment you need to defeat an armed, violent insurgency. And he says, In addition to the devices invented and designed for conventional war, which are also useful for fighting insurgents, there must be many others invented and designed for industry or commerce, which would also be useful if they could be identified and adapted to the purpose. No survey of the equipment which the Army needs in order to make it ready to fight insurgents would be complete without reference to these devices, and anything which would help in developing background information into contact information would be of particular interest. So contact, I mean, we talked a little bit about contact information, but that term is quite fascinating. One way of approaching the subject would be to imagine a tactical problem and then see whether technology might be able to help in solving it. For example, under present arrangements, a member of the intelligence organization called to interrogate a prisoner in a forward area would be most unlikely to make any headway until he could get the man back to his office, where he has the records of all the enemy groups in his area, together with the details about their arms, contacts, and other points of interest. He talked about this a lot in Gangs and Counter Gangs, around how they would capture prisoners and interrogate them, but they wouldn't have enough information to ask the right questions, or they wouldn't have enough information to be able to catch the prisoner in a lie, which they could then use as leverage to flip them. So he's kind of reflecting on that experience of not having enough information to actually do that. So he goes on and on and on and on. And then he says, from a purely technological point of view, it would presumably be possible to solve this problem. All that would be necessary would be for a central computer to store all information held in all branches of the intelligence organization throughout the country, and for each member of the intelligence organization to be equipped with some form of wireless, which would enable him to contact the computer from anywhere in his area. By this means, the interrogator in the forward area could, in theory, get the information which he needs in order to break down the prisoner without delay. And then he goes on and on, but this is another instance of what you were just talking about in terms of him obliquely suggesting something that he knew was already a thing, right? So he's very tapped in to the developments in technology. So he's sort of saying this hypothetically, but this is what he starts to help put into practice in Northern Ireland, and there are other folks who are at the same time doing it in the United States. In Tip of the Spear, I talk about the New York State Identification and Intelligence System, which was a version of this in New York. They were doing it in California. So this is like part of the early history of the internet that's discussed in Yasha Levine's book, Surveillance Valley. So Kitson is very much tied to this history as well. But all of it is about, this was a long tangent to say that, yes, this focus on low-grade sources becomes useful, imminently more useful with the development of these networked devices or the internet.
100%. And I mean, I think so. There's always, I think, when you get to this kind of revelation, a fear that sets in with people, probably rightfully so, about how much we constantly share about ourselves online, how much is out there, and so on. And it is a good reason, I think, for anybody who's really involved in movements to be very careful about what they actually share in those spaces. And I think it should draw all of us to be very thoughtful about that stuff. And I will say too, like, my conversations with Lara Shihai, like, we've talked about this on the platform of, when she goes back and forth, because she works in Doha right now and she lives in the United States, that she stopped at the border every time and interrogated at this point, that they ask her about podcasts, that they ask her about they give her lists of activists and ask her to identify and so on. She doesn't participate in any of this, right? You even as a green card holder, there are certain questions that you do not have to answer, and knowing what questions you do and don't have to answer is really important. But it also just speaks to this point of this whole book, one of the things that just stood out to me is like, this is why you don't talk to police. This is why you don't talk to the feds. Like, this is why all of those, um, know your rights, or like what to do things that come out from National Lawyers Guild or whoever else. Like, they're really important because it can seem like a fairly benign conversation. It can seem like they will present things that they know. And he talks about this in developing background information into contact information. They'll present things that they know. They may speculate on certain things. And they'll make it seem as if you're just kind of, they already know it. So why aren't you saying it, kind of thing, or whatever. And like, they're using all of those interviews, and you could tell them something that you might think is a fairly benign detail, but to them, it helps them connect a dot that's important in, their investigation, or, the RICO case they're working on, or whatever it is, and I just think that that's really important, even if you're not that involved in movements, but folks, because that's the other thing too, is like, there's a lot of, in this, he talks about information that they are able to get by capturing actual insurgents, which of course means information that they're getting by torturing people. But he's also just talking about, working among, I mean, he puts it in very benign terms. He's also probably torturing in a lot of these instances too. But like, other people within the population who are not part of the movement, but know certain things about, oh, this baker is supplying bread to the rebels, or, this farmer is, giving some of his crops to the rebels, or so on. And like, developing all of that information to a point where then they can, you know, have an effective tactical response basically to an insurgency.
Yeah, to put something in the bread, which they talk about. They talk about that.
Yeah. All right. So we can go. So here's where he gets more into like forms of counter organization, counter gangs, pseudo gangs. Do you want to share some stuff here?
Sure. I mean, so he also talks a lot about reform here, the importance of reform, right? So like chapter 4, he at the preparatory stages, he's more talking about counter organization. Chapter 5, he spends a lot of time talking about reform as an effective way to sort of undermine movements that have developed into actual movements. So I think that's really important. What did I want to do here? Oh, the sort of the counter gang stuff. Sure. So let's go through those documents. The first batch of documents. So the first one is a page from Bunch of Five. Let's see.
Yeah.
So Bunch of Five is a book. I believe he wrote. I think he wrote Bunch of Five after. Bunch of Five came out several years after this book, and it's a little more autobiographical. So
which folder am I in?
Rand.
Okay, there we go. All right, yeah. I got it. All right.
Oh, of course not. I didn't rotate this document, so it's
I think I can do that. Hang on, I gotta download it.
Okay, first. So let me read this. So he says, so this is 1962, right after I believe he's enmeshed in I can't remember what he was doing, but he talks about how he comes to the United States in 1962 for 6 months to lead a course at the Armed Forces Staff College in the U.S. And then he says the following. Again, this is from Bunch of Five. He says, shortly before I returned to England, President Kennedy asked the Vice President, that's Lyndon Johnson, to set up a symposium to study in detail every known aspect of counterinsurgency operations. So the result of that study is this thing I just was reading from.
Here, I can share it if you want. Let's see.
He says, I was asked to talk about the emergency in Kenya. When I arrived, the symposium had already been in progress for several days, and the conference room was full of an extraordinary variety of people. So that's one thing I wanted to emphasize. He's coming to the Rand Corporation, which is over in my neck of the woods in Northern Virginia. He's talking, there's all these other, so David Galula's there. He's a really important counterinsurgency person. Who else is there?
Thompson, right?
Oh yeah, Walter Thompson is there. Oh, Robert Thompson is there. But who's the other guy? Charles Bohannon. But wait. Oh, Edward Lansdale. But and then a lot of other people who I'm less familiar with. But he's talking about an extraordinary variety of people were there. Right, from the U.S. Not only were there representatives from most of the world's armies which had fought against guerrillas, but also in a few cases there were representatives of the guerrillas themselves. Very soon after arriving, I became aware of an interesting fact. Although we came from such a widely divergent backgrounds, it was as if we had all been brought up together from youth. We all spoke the same language. Probably all of us had worked out theories of counterinsurgency procedures at one time or another, which we thought were unique and original, but when we came to air them, all our ideas were essentially the same. So he comes to the US and he comes to the Rand Corporation. So then I wanted to go to, oh, I'm sorry, hold on one second.
You're fine.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the Rand Corporation. Like, let's talk about what that is. So if you could go to the other war document, that's number 2, the history of Rand,
yeah.
And then go to page 5. So this is if you could show people the title first.
Yep, I'll pull it up. It's just going to take a second.
Most Rand Corporation documents you can get from the website for free. So this document is fairly easy to find. It's from 2006. It's by someone called Austin Long. Yeah. And if you scroll down to page 5, he talks about the history of Rand.
Is this it? Oh, no.
Yeah. As World War II drew to a close, the commanding general of the Armed Army Air Force was concerned about the future. Air power and technology appeared inextricably tied together, particularly in the dawning of the atomic age. Yet General Henry Hap Arnold was worried that without the impetus of war, U.S. scientists would return to universities, depriving the military of their expertise. By scientists, he that includes sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, like the social sciences. In order to ensure access to elite intellectual talent, Arnold and others in and out of government established the Research and Development Rand Corporation in October 1945. Rand quickly grew into an interdisciplinary think tank concerned with problems of the nascent Cold War. I'm going to skip that paragraph. He says, counterinsurgency had not entered the lexicon of defense planning at Rand at this period. The first attempt to address this problem came in 1958 with a set of war games at Rand known as Sierra. These war games sought to explore the possibility of limited war in Asia in light of the U.S. experience in Korea and the French war in Indochina. And he keeps going, right? But let me scroll down to where they talk a little bit about Kennedy. That's at the bottom of page 6. As the Kennedy administration took office and insurgency was gaining strength in South Vietnam, one of the countries formed by the dissolution of the French Indochina, following the French loss to the insurgents in 1954, the United States had committed itself to supporting an independent, non-communist South Vietnam, but the government of Ngo Diem was increasingly unable to resist insurgents supported by the communist North Vietnam. Rand would quickly become intimately involved with both the general problem of counterinsurgency and the specific problem of Vietnam. So So Rand, it started as an arm of the US government. They spin off and become an independent think tank. But the primary aim, or one of the primary things that it does, is it draws elite social scientists into its fold to help develop counterinsurgency knowledge.
I just noted here it has Advanced Research Project Agency, ARPA, which is also where DARPANet gets developed out of, right? Which
The
is the
internet. That's
So,
what this is exactly what I'm saying. He's part of this
yeah.
network. Kitson's part of this network. So we already showed you the actual document, the symposium from '62, which you can download from the website. So let's go to Stuart Schrader's article.
Okay.
That's number 4. Okay, so
I'll pull it up. Go ahead.
So Kennedy is the person who's really spearheading the development of this idea of counterinsurgency in the US under the banner of counterinsurgency. What's interesting here is that his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, is the person who's responsible for convening this counterinsurgency symposium. Johnson obviously becomes president after Kennedy's assassinated. And Johnson, and you talked about this with Neil Klaus, Johnson is associated with the Great Society programs, right? Stuart Schrader is a really great historian around my way in Baltimore, and he wrote this essay called "To Secure the Global Great Society: Participation in Pacification." And I just wanted to read some of this so that we can understand that the Great Society programs and the LEAA, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which was established in 1968, were established as part of this global sort of counterinsurgency regime. So Schrader says, this is his article, in March 1971, a high-ranking U.S. official reflected on the past several years of novel poverty alleviation programming, right? So again, going back to Kitson in the preparatory phases and the nonviolent phases, and when we talked about what counter-organization looks like, he said, setting up health clinics and doing all these things which, read on the outside as these positive things. So this is similar to what's happening in the Great Society. He described how the twinned mandate of maximum participation of the people and encouragement of local government institutions form the cornerstone of efforts to ameliorate dismal socioeconomic conditions that had for too long left many citizens bereft of hope for the future. Even worse, the desperate had been turning to violent means of social transformation. In many cities, he noted, a situation of volatility, unemployment among the urban population of skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled labor had resulted in the need for community participation to channel their energies in positive rather than protest activities. Now, according to legislation that required popular democratic participation, recipients of economic aid could themselves play a part in determining what their own communities needed and how best to address those felt needs. Community members, not just outside experts, would play a role in managing aid efforts, with the concept of the local community placed at the heart of the plan. Communication lines had opened between various levels of government, leading to widespread dissemination of information about the programs and high-level attention to locally generated ideas. So what he's doing, what Stuart Schrader's doing as an author, is writing this in such a way that you think that this first paragraph is him writing about the Great Society programs, because that's pretty much exactly the language that was used domestically in order to frame those programs. But the above passage that I just read, and as Schrader describes here, they weren't from the War on Poverty, which talked about, quote, maximum feasible participation. They were spoken by William E. Colby, the future director of the CIA, and at the time he was overseeing civil operations and rural development support, the centralized civilian directorate for all counterinsurgency operations in South Vietnam, or what it called pacification. All right. So this whole article is about the symmetry between the sort of Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 in the US and the sort of anti-poverty programs in the US, and the way that some of the same people and the same language were involved in developing pacification programs in South Vietnam. So I can stop there for a second. There's more, but I wanted to, just in case you wanted to respond or say anything about any of that.
No, other than, I mean, so Neocleus deals with this in pacification too. It was funny because he was like, I was like, your chapter on Vietnam, and he's like, it's not a chapter on Vietnam. But he does talk about this in terms of the Great Society in the same way, and also just in terms of like, as you dig into different counterinsurgents, like they understand it in the same way too. So it's not just critical academics today drawing these connections. Counterinsurgents often drew them themselves of like, this is a this is a pacification program, in the United States and so on. And I think anyway, again, I think it draws to kind of the connection I was making a little bit earlier, which is like, it may look a little bit differently in the context of South Vietnam, where there's going to be more violence. There's going to be more, part of what caused a lot of people to kind of turn against Vietnam was seeing different things televised in terms of like what was actually going on there. And even, I mean, I don't remember it was in Neocleus too, where he talks about like Agent Orange and, how this was a counterinsurgency strategy, right? To just defoliate, to basically eliminate the jungle, right? But like, it was so toxic, and obviously people are still, have cancer and things like that from this stuff. But yeah, there's all these tactics, I guess I would say, in one setting that raise alarm bells in the ways that a lot of this within like a US context, people just see it as, oh yeah, these are programs, like these are things. Like, it's interesting too. I always think one of the interesting things in the 60s is looking at the number of revolutionaries who actually worked in Great Society programs at some point and then become more radicalized and realize like, oh no, we need to do something for ourselves and we're going to organize this way. And just, it's interesting to think about like how much information did the government have about them, just based also on their own participation in those programs earlier on and so on. But yeah, it's an interesting.
Yeah, Dhoruba bin Mohad often talks about how the Black Panther Party office in Harlem was that they basically just took it over from some of the, what they would call poverty pimps, who were getting this money, but like not doing anything. And that office was just there. So they just took it over and never had to pay any rent. Right. So that's the other thing that, like, in terms of, because Jay Sakai is talking about how these ideas can function as a sort of like dissuade people from getting involved in organizing. But what a lot of this literature doesn't address is how people are constantly, subverting counterinsurgency and moving around it, right? So and that was sort of my question around Neoclaus. I mean, I was sort of hastily typing it on my phone or whatever, but just around this question of failure and counterinsurgency's need to constantly reinvent itself. The only other thing I wanted to say about RAND, and I can make it brief because I want to talk a little bit about the FBI. I realized that wasn't actually the counter gangs part, is that beginning in the 70s, RAND starts to get involved in urban governance. And they start to pivot away from just explicitly doing counterinsurgency research to figuring out how to apply the knowledge that they generated from counterinsurgency to problems of civil governance, right? So including problems of urban rebellions. And so counterinsurgency knowledge then becomes sort of integrated again, partly through the rise of networked computers, which is happening at the same time. It becomes integrated into urban governance. And so there's a book about this called From Warfare to Welfare by Jennifer S. Light, who used to work for the Rand Corporation, and the sort of in the acknowledgments of the book, thanks the Rand Corporation for all the support they gave her in writing the book. And so I don't actually think it doesn't go where I would go analytically, but in terms of the history, there's some really interesting stuff in there. Also about the history of cable television as a weapon of psychological warfare. Really interesting stuff, right? So there's that. But if I can talk a little bit more about, that's the book there.
I just want to say quickly too, I mean, and that's the thing, is like none of this, I mean, one, it's amazing how much these people publish. Mm-hmm. Like how much academic literature there is about all this stuff, and then how much literature there is written by, military officers about all this stuff. There's way more books, I think, about counterinsurgency and these institutions than we really have in terms of like, the texts that, for instance, Kitson is analyzing, which are like revolutionary texts that are really talking about strategies and tactics and campaigns, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's interesting to read this stuff, but as you said, like analytically, these folks never go where you or I would, because they don't see the world in the same way that we do.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about this claim about pseudo-gangs operating in the United States that Kitson sort of papers over really quickly. So the quote from Kitson is on page 100 of the edition that you and I have. He says, "In the last war, the Germans repeatedly made use of special operations." And this is, he uses that term in interesting ways. Special operations against partisans in the occupied countries. And Filipinos used pseudo-gangs against the Huk guerrillas to good effect. General Masu used turncoats in Algiers, and the British used captured insurgents extensively in Kenya, and to a lesser extent in Cyprus. There is some evidence to the effect that pseudo-gangs of ultra-militant black nationalists are operating now in the United States. So that's the thing, right? So that citation goes to Mark Oppenheimer.
Right.
And I included the relevant, so just a little, I don't know a whole lot about Mark Oppenheimer. He's a professor. I think he's a emeritus professor at Rutgers. I think he's still there in some capacity.
Martin Oppenheimer.
I'm sorry. Right? Martin Oppenheimer. Yeah. So he wrote this book, The Urban Guerrilla, in 1969. 4 years earlier, he co-authored A Manual for Direct Action, Strategy and Tactics for Civil Rights, and All Other Nonviolent Protest Movements, which was used as a political education manual during the Freedom Summer. And it has a foreword by Bayard Rustin, who we know was an op. He begins this book by talking about how it developed in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination. So it's like he's pivoting, in the wake of, the generalized death of nonviolence as the dominant strategy within the Black liberation struggle. But I don't know, I find it really interesting that his other book was extremely practical, like it was used as a manual. And again, the state understood the Freedom Summer through the lens of counterinsurgency. So he's very much a scholar of like domestic war or internal war. In fact, this book is included on several military syllabi on internal warfare. So his work is like taken up in a really practical way, which I find fascinating. It's a very interesting book. There's a lot of problems.
For just a second, what were you saying about the Freedom Summer?
Oh, A Manual for Direct Action, the book that came out before this, was one of the books that they used for political education around the tactics of nonviolence during the Freedom Summer. He wrote that book. Bayard Rustin wrote the foreword to it, and then it circulated widely within that movement.
So, but you're saying, you said something about the state understood it through the lens of counterinsurgency, meaning it was something that they. Go ahead.
So here, I think I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just going to say, so meaning that the state understood it as something that they needed to practice counterinsurgency on, or they understood doing the Freedom Center as actually a
oh no, that's not what
campaign.
I meant. I don't know. I don't know. No, that's not what I meant. I guess what I'm gonna say a few more things about Oppenheimer in a minute. They'll become clear. And thank you. I'm sorry for not being more clear. I guess what I'm trying to highlight now is both of these books are being used in really practical ways. His first book was used by people on the ground to help inform their strategy. What people think about that strategy, and that's a whole other thing. I'm just saying, like, he's an academic who's doing very work that's being used, right? This book is very clearly of interest to the counterinsurgent state. And I think his first book probably was too. But we know that because Kitson's citing it and because it's showing up on all these military syllabi about internal war. Is that
interesting?
More clear?
Yeah, I just want to read a little bit of what Sakai says specifically about this passage. So he says, well, General Kitson obviously believed that only his fellow security officers would read this revealing comment. He properly had to formally deny that this information was officially leaked from his Pentagon colleagues, such as General Stilwell. So General Kitson's study says that his source of information on that was a book by a white pacifist professor in Philadelphia. This Euro-American professor, who is a former civil rights supporter and an advocate of nonviolent integrationism, claims that one line of a book he had heard unspecified unspecified rumors, that's in quotes, discrediting some unknown armed black nationalists as pseudos. This is the lightest of smokescreens, since it is obvious that a close imperialist colleague of top Pentagon and CIA officials doesn't depend on rumors allegedly heard by a pacifist college professor to know about U.S. counterinsurgency operations. It is interesting that a leading U.S. counterinsurgency official was pushing General Kitson's pseudo-gang theories. Perhaps the experience of Kenya has practical application for us today. So anyways, it's just Sakai saying that this, the pseudo-gangs tactic is something that people should study and understand, but also saying that, he thinks in this case, Kitson's just using Oppenheimer as cover to hide other sources of his information.
Joe, but I'm so glad you read that. But check this out. Can you pull up the Soro one, the Soro document? I think that's document.
Yep.
You see it? Okay. Yeah. So maybe he's using Oppenheimer as a cover. On page 100, Oppenheimer says, let's see, where is it?
Yeah, I got it.
That's the wrong one. Wait, is this it? Of course I missed it. Oh, page 70, sorry. No, you're good. Yeah. Okay, he says, this is Oppenheimer. He says, a revolutionary organization operating clandestinely is also open to a countermeasure called the Pseudo-Gang. This is what Oppenheimer says. And when he says that, he has a citation. So we're going through a citational journey here. Kitson makes a claim that counter gangs are happening, that counter organizations are happening in the U.S. To make that claim, no, you're right. You're right. That's okay. Perfect. That's perfect. Okay. I'm trying to make sure everybody's clear on what we're doing. Yep. Kitson makes a claim that counter gangs are happening in the United States with ultra black nationalists. To support that claim, he cites Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer says that there's this tactic called the pseudo-gang, and then he has a citation. That citation leads to this document. This report is the Special Operations Research Organization, which is a counterinsurgency think tank that developed at my university, American University, in the 1960s, where they were trying to pull in, again, anthropologists and psychologists to figure out how to incorporate counterinsurgency into development practices, specifically in Latin America. So this is one of their reports. And their report talks about pseudo-gangs. Can you read that? Because I don't even have mine open. Do you see it?
Yeah, I can. Hang on.
Okay.
Just read the whole section.
The highlighted part.
Yep. So pseudo-gangs and large unit infiltration. The Germans used dummies on pseudo-gangs, individuals disguised as terrorists or guerrillas in Russia, and the British used them in Kenya and Palestine. The British used ex-terrorists and European military men who disguised themselves as Mau Mau to penetrate this terrorist organization and gain intelligence. They dressed and acted as terrorists. The Europeans used burnt cork or boot black to color their skin. Shout out to blackface. Learned Mau Mau handshakes, songs, and used terrorist clothing and equipment. The pseudo-gang used homemade guns, wore ragged overcoats, and Mau Mau beads. They contacted other Mau Mau terrorist gangs and gained valuable information about the organization and its leaders. In the Philippines, the security forces used an organization called Force X to carry out large unit infiltration. The prime objective of this force, as was that of the pseudo-gangs in Kenya, was to obtain intelligence. By penetrating the insurgent organization, they were able to gain information about the security, communications, and supply systems, as well as the nature and extent of civilian support and liaison methods. They would go into villages disguised as huks, and in this way determine which officials and civilians were working with the insurgents. Still another way to infiltrate is to create a group which is independent of the underground, but which appears to be operating against the government for its own security, because the group could draw the attention of security forces and other subversive activity. The underground will contact this group with the intention of restricting its movements or of absorbing it into the movement. Yeah, that's a good summary.
Yeah, exactly. And the part about the counter gangs in Kenya cites Kitson. It cites gangs and counter gangs. So Kitson and this dude are like literally they're having a citational dialogue, which I find really interesting. So Kitson citing him, he's citing Kitson. I find that very interesting. So that's the first sentence of the thing that Kitson cites. But then this guy Oppenheimer goes on to say, he's explaining what a pseudo operation is. This is an operation in which the government recruits a group to pose as an independent revolutionary organization. This group then carries out several illegal acts. So that's something that the others don't talk about. Kitson just talks about it as intelligence gathering. He's at least saying, yeah, they're actually doing more than that. They're doing a lot more than that. So this is the example that he uses, Oppenheimer, of the counter gang happening in the US. He says the secret organization's vulnerability to police agents' provocation and entrapment is easy to see. In the spring of 1968, a New York City detective testified how he had infiltrated the Revolutionary Action Movement, a Black nationalist group, and became a member of a 3-man terrorist cell that was to murder several prominent moderate civil rights leaders. He had himself played a part in the alleged conspiracy, so that the police department had, in effect, assisted the plot. It was his word against the defendants. They were convicted. Secret societies are made to order for that kind of setup and really have no way of protecting themselves against it. So he's talking about RAM, the Revolutionary Action Movement, and this idea that in 1965, 3 members of RAM, one of whom would later go on to be part of the Panther 21. I can't remember who the name escapes me at the moment. were convicted of criminal anarchy for plotting to blow up the Statue of Liberty and for plotting to assassinate Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young, those are the moderate civil rights leaders, right? But all of that was sort of fomented by an undercover New York City police informant he was an officer named Raymond Wood, who had infiltrated RAM from the beginning. 2 years later, in '67, 17 members of the Revolutionary Action Movement were arrested for a similar thing. So this is what Oppenheimer's talking about. So if we go
Wood also shows up in the death of Malcolm X too, by the way.
Wood shows up and 5 days after that, the plot to assassinate Whitney Young and all that happens, Malcolm X is assassinated 5 days later. 5 days later, and one of the first people to his body, the one who gives him mouth to mouth, is Gene Roberts, who's another undercover NYPD boss agent. All right. So in other words, COINTELPRO tactics are part of this legacy of the counter gang. That's what's being implied here. Now this guy doesn't know about. I can't say he doesn't know about it, because I think that his level of knowledge is suspect to me. I have to say that. I don't know. Nobody else was talking about this at this time, and I don't know anyone on the left who used this book. The state definitely liked this book because they used it quite a bit and read it and cited it and whatever. I don't.
Yeah, no, the left was using. They were using Mariella. They were using the mini manual of urban guerrilla warfare. Yeah,
and we're going to talk about that in a second. So then I have the. Can you go to the COINTELPRO document?
Yes.
That's number. I don't know. I numbered them.
Yeah, 3, I think.
Yeah. So this is like the famous COINTELPRO, one of the famous COINTELPRO documents, where he talks about preventing the rise of the Black Messiah. He being Hoover.
Yep. Hang on. Is it there? Yeah.
Yeah. So this was so at the time. So I don't know. I hadn't heard anyone refer to what happened to RAM through the counter gang language. Oppenheimer's the first that I know about. And he wrote this book came out in 1969. Okay. This FBI memo came out in 1968. Obviously, it remained secret until 73, something like that. Somewhere around there. If you scroll down to the second page, so Hoover's talking about counterintelligence and everything. This is Hoover writing, or someone writing on his behalf. He says here, toward the bottom, the Revolutionary Action Movement, a pro-Chinese communist group, was active in Philadelphia in the summer of 1967. The Philadelphia office alerted local police, who then put RAM leaders under close scrutiny. They were arrested on every possible charge until they could no longer make bail. As a result, RAM leaders spent most of the summer in jail, and no violence traceable to RAM took place. So they're talking here specifically about using the jail as a method of preventive detention. They're talking about the role that the local police are playing, but clearly the FBI is also playing a role in this. And so, yeah, Oppenheimer was real tapped in terms of in terms of his knowledge of what was going on and his reading of that. And he's citing Kitson citing him. I don't know. It's all very interesting. If you go back to that document,
it'd be fascinating to know if he was at the Rand
this is what I'm
meeting,
saying,
because Kitson's like there's a variety of individuals here, and
this is what I'm saying.
Clearly,
and that's
the thing too. Yeah, and I mean that's the same. When you talk about the counterinsurgency field manual we have today and how it was written, it's like the Atlantic was there. All these all these different, you know, and so they, and a bunch of academics, a bunch of human rights people, like all of this kind of stuff. So anyway,
if you could go back to that document real quick,
yep,
the COINTELPRO one.
yep.
The first goal, he's talking, Hoover's laying out the long range plans. Yep, scroll down a little bit. Yep, boom. Prevent the coalition of Black nationalist groups. In unity there is strength, the truism that is no less valid for all its triteness. An effective coalition of Black nationalist groups might be the first step toward a real Mau Mau in America, the beginning of a true Black revolution, right? So I think we need to read this as a citation of the archive of counterinsurgency, and in some ways a citation of, you know, the work that is being done. So low intensity operations wasn't out at this time. It wasn't published, but Kitson had already been to the US, been at the Rand Corporation. The Rand Corporation is plugged into this whole network, right? And so I just think it's really important to think about this in this context, and also to think about, and this is important, counterintelligence, like the counterintelligence program, that phrase, that's a propaganda phrase, because the counterintelligence, strictly speaking, is the attempt to prevent other governments from getting intelligence on your government. It's an attempt to prevent foreign governments from stealing intelligence. That's what that term means. That's not what that's not what the counterintelligence program was. COINTELPRO was a covert action program or a counterinsurgency program. So I don't know if it's just a happy coincidence that COIN, you can call counterintelligence COIN and you can call counterinsurgency COIN, but you know, it's a misnomer. That's not what's happening here. And in some ways that term was used to validate some of the stuff that was happening. Like, oh, we have to do this in the name of, to prevent these foreign governments that these people have connections with from operating within our borders or whatever.
100%. And I mean, this is where the mind of the counterinsurgent, I think it's kind of interesting, because for one, like, these people all agree on the idea that communism and socialism are completely unacceptable ideas. And, you know, actually Neoclis talks about this too, of, you know, he has this section where he talks about containment, and we talked about it earlier. Kitson referenced it actually in one of the things of, like, containing the ideas, right, and containing the politics, right? And so they're obsessed with what people think, you know, and in actually eliminating, like, thought, you know, like getting rid of any ideas of ways to operate a society, basically, that are outside of their order. And I think it's just really fascinating on some level, because, like, when the way that this plays out within Kitson, obviously there's all of this stuff, but, like, a lot of it for him is like, okay, the Soviet Union and China are trying to do all of these different things. They're trying to spread communism. They always make it seem like it's something that the people wouldn't want, like that even, like, locals, whether it's in Kenya or wherever, right, that they're against these ideas, and we have to go and kill the people who have these ideas, basically, and, you know, separate them out of the population so that those ideas don't spread, you know. And it's yeah, I mean, like, J. Edgar Hoover and COINTELPRO and Chaos and all of these kind of, you know, programs, they're all based on this same kind of premise of, you know, even if the Soviet Union is not actually directing these things, these people are influenced by the ideas of, you know, communism, and therefore it's basically the same thing. It's interesting too, even to think about that in terms of, like, this moment where we have, you know, green card folks and people on visas being deported for, you know, ideological support of, like, Hamas or whatever, you know, of, like, you're not actually saying that there's a connection or that these people are, you know, actual agents of this thing called Hamas in your mind, right? But you're saying that ideologically there's some kind of support or solidarity or whatever, and we can't even allow that, right? And so it's very interesting just in terms of thinking about it just through a lens of like mind control, you know.
No, 100%. Can you pull up the law enforcement bulletin from 1974, the second one, the last document? And while you do that, let me say, you know, I talk in my book about Bertram S. Brown, who was at one point the director of the National Institutes of Mental Health. In 1964, he went to a federal prison conference and there were Edgar Schein was there, and you know, this is like the moment where like behavior modification becomes like a federally funded project. Bertram S. Brown is there, and he encourages all of the sort of wardens to experiment on mind control. And then in 73, he's at the prison conference where all the prison administrators are there, and he talks about the need to study propaganda in prisons because it will help us understand how to control how people think outside of prison walls. Well, after he leaves the National Institutes of Mental Health, he becomes a fellow at the Rand Corporation for several years. I don't know what he's doing there, but I'm just saying these are the connections that are being made. So the article, the last thing I wanted to show was on page 19. So this is the FBI's magazine, right?
This is
so
great
yeah,
too. Trends in urban guerrilla tactics there.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's actually what I meant to show.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I think this is the wrong one. Well, we can look at this one too. I might have put them in wrong. But so they're talking to each other about how to deal with urban guerrilla warfare. And if you just, I just want to look, let's just look at who they're citing at the end of this article. This is available for free online. So lots of people like to talk about, wow, how'd you do all this archival research? Like, where'd you find all these things? Like, so a lot of this stuff is for free online. You just got to know where and how to look for it.
There's Marighella.
There he is. So Marighella's there. They're citing the BLA. They're citing Right On.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, if you could just scroll down a little bit. This is the works cited page right here at the end. They're citing Che. They're citing
Stokely
the BLA.
Carmichael.
Yep. And Frank Kitson.
Frank Kitson.
Yep.
Outlaws of America, Communiques from the Weather Underground, Che.
Yep.
Robert Moss.
And then the other one, which you can open it if you want to, it's not necessary. It's more or less the same citationally, but they're also citing this guy Oppenheimer, this book Oppenheimer.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty clear that
which one is that?
Back to it's the Law Enforcement Bulletin from 1974.
Okay, let's see. I see it now. Got it.
Back to our conversation from last time where we were talking about, like, okay, how the state studies this kind of work and what it's who it's useful for. This book was clearly more useful for the state than it was for anybody else, because I don't know anybody who's really read this.
Which book is that?
The
Urban Guerrilla one?
Yeah. So that one should be on page 19.
Okay. All right. My bad, y'all. Oh, this should get to it. Okay. This is what you wanted to show?
Yeah. And just the citations again. I mean, you can, that one's pretty highlighted because I found this to be interesting to think about, like FBI tactics or whatever. But just in terms of citationally and Kitson's legacy, I guess I'm just trying to show Kitson's legacy domestically within the FBI, within local governance, in terms of the Rand Corporation partnering with cities, and all the rest of it, So you've got Kitson, you've got Margiela, you've got Oppenheimer.
And Nkrumah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway,
So this is a case.
Yeah,
This
there's
is me
upside.
making a case for why we need to be thinking about counterinsurgency, but again, without internalizing it and without normalizing its philosophical flaws, its conceptual flaws, its flawed conceptualization of like what people are and how we work and how we think.
Yeah. I mean, I find, having done some counter study of this stuff, most people, if they're the least bit radical, you know, the least bit left, like, find this stuff really abhorrent when they dig into it because of all the admissions that it has and because of how easily they will step into a language of like, well, we just kill these people. We just, you know, and like most people are just uncomfortable with like, I think a lot of the counterinsurgency people think that that most people agree with them, you know, but I find that actually, at least if you read it in a group setting where you're actually like digging into a little bit, like, what are they doing in this paragraph? You know, like most people are not on board
I
with that
hope that's
project.
true. I hope that's true.
It's been my experience, at least, you know, and granted, obviously, you know,
you roll in certain circles though, Jared.
Yes, the people who listen to this podcast, you know, but I just mean that in terms of like, I think that there's a lot of potential for like reading groups around this kind of stuff with people to kind of expose to them also why, and I think we should get into this because we should talk about nonviolence a little bit. We kind of didn't go into that discussion. You know, Kitson has this whole section on nonviolence, and a lot of it's based on, you know, reading Gene Sharp, who ostensibly, again, is somebody who's writing for movements, but his work is used by the CIA and the School of Americas in terms of training, you know, guarimbas in Venezuela or whatever else. Like, but the reality, one of the things that's interesting is his conclusions, which are that like nonviolence doesn't work unless it's tied to more militant forms of struggle, basically.
Which is something that a lot of people in the movement understood as well.
Right. You know, and he's not saying don't do it, you know, I mean, he's not, you shouldn't take advice from him anyway, but like, he's not sort of saying like it doesn't work at all or it doesn't present certain problems. He recognizes that it absolutely does, but he's basically like, if a movement just sticks to nonviolence, there's no problem with us in subverting it, basically. And the methods that he lays out on that, I think, are interesting. They're the same ones. I mean, I've talked through some of this stuff with people before, you know, in terms of how counterinsurgencies think about their campaigns and splitting people off. You know, one of the books behind me is The Ungovernable Society, and he has a section in it where he lays this out that I've gone through with folks a few times. But Kitson's version of it is basically that you have to separate. Let's see, let me see if I can find the part where he says. So he says,
is this page 85? Oh, go ahead.
Probably. Well, 83. So basically, he says it probably is 85. He lumps people into extremists, moderates, and idealists. And, you know, he goes through this argument of it's difficult to get anyone to protest for things like period, especially things that will at best nominally benefit them. And so, you know, most of the people who do protests are radicals, you know, which also is part of why he's like, it's a good time the nonviolent phase is also a good time to infiltrate their movements because, you know, in that phase, a lot of the radicals are out and you can, you know.
Well, they're either radicals or they're people who are being manipulated by radicals because rational people wouldn't protest, according to Kitson, right? So the whole thing, and this gets back to what he talks about in the beginning, like the militants, the radicals choose demands, which most of the time don't reflect their actual desires, which are to overthrow the government. Because Kitson thinks that most sane people don't want revolution. They actually want capitalism. They want colonialism. They want things more or less how they are. So they have to be manipulated into protesting for some small reform, but they're being duped essentially by these militants, right? Would you agree that that's more or less what he's arguing?
It is, yeah. He doesn't think that most people give a shit basically about anything, you know. Yeah, and it's interesting too in terms of the tactics of subversion that he then, you know, identifies of like he talks about here, I'll pull it up for a second. I thought this, as a rule, the most effective method of preventing trouble or of damping it down, should it break out, is by negotiation. But the point that he makes is like he basically has three methods that he identifies, which are concessions, co-optation, and neutralization. I would say, you know, that you give concessions to people, right? Which again, gets to like, why does counterinsurgency have these like positive aspects, right? It's like you do certain reforms, you give people certain things to take away, especially to take moderates out of the equation.
Yeah, that's it.
Right?
You're not giving concessions to militants. You're killing militants. The militants get killed and tortured. That sends a message to the moderates that if you go outside of this frame, this is what will happen to you. Then you give, so when he's talking about negotiation, I think he's being honest there. It's just with a specific population. Do you know what I mean? And he says this. He says on page 87, he says, page 85, he says, as the campaign develops, a split is likely to open between the organizers and their followers. And the more successful the campaign, the wider will be the split, because the greater the number of concessions granted. He's the counterinsurgent campaign. As the counterinsurgent campaign develops, he's saying, a split will open up because the greater the number of concessions granted by the government, the less have the participants to gain from seeing it overthrown. So it's this kind of constant management.
Yeah, I appreciated this part too. He says, for the purposes of this study, no account will be taken of the simplest method of all, which is to suppress the movement by the ruthless application of naked force. Because although nonviolent campaigns are particularly vulnerable to this sort of action, it is most unlikely that the British government, or indeed any Western government, would be politically able to operate on these lines even if it wanted to do so. Right. And so then he goes into this, you know, the most promising approach is separating the mass of those engaged in the campaign from the leadership. I think that's the part you were talking about right there. But yeah, I mean, I always love these he always has these little admissions of like, you know, the easiest way would just be to kill everybody, but that's probably not going to be the thing that our government will allow us to do. So in this case, like, let's do this, you know.
And again, I think he's talking about within the imperial core.
Right.
I think that's that's what he's talking about.
He makes that quite clear. He's like, yeah, Britain is not likely to allow us to do that here. You know, and even though he doesn't really, he kind of euphemistically or glosses over a lot of that when he's talking about what's going on within colonial settings. But, you know, when you read between the lines, you can kind of see it there too, of just like, you know, we eliminated these people, or we, you know.
So here's more on this. Yeah, here's more on the concessions and the reform and all that on page 87. I mean, this is all he talks about this constantly. In practical terms, the most promising line of approach lies in separating the mass of those engaged in the campaign from the leadership by the judicial promise of concessions. Is this what you just read, the same page?
It is, yeah. I read the section right before that, so go ahead.
Okay, yeah. At the same time, imposing a period of calm by the use of government forces backed up by statements to the effect that most of the concessions can only be implemented once the life of the country returns to normal. Although with an eye to world opinion and to the need to retain the allegiance of the people, no more force than necessary for containing the situation should be used. Conditions can be made reasonably uncomfortable for the population as a whole in order to provide an incentive for return to normal life. So this is the carrot and the stick. Having once succeeded in providing a breathing space by these means, it is most important to do three further things quickly. The first is to implement the promised concessions so as to avoid allegations of bad faith, which may enable the subversive leadership to regain control over certain sections of the people. The second is to discover and neutralize the genuine subversive element. Neutralize means to convert, capture, or kill. So basically to torture, imprison, or kill, or all the above. The third is to associate as many prominent members of the population, especially those who have been engaged in nonviolent action, with the government. This last technique, known in America as co-optation, is and is described by Messieurs Hush and Schobach as drowning the revolution in baby milk, which I think is a very evocative phrase, right? But this idea of creating breathing room is really interesting because both sides are trying to create breathing room, right? So I think often about Fanon in Wretched of the Earth, he talks about how we revolt because we cannot breathe, right? And in Tip of the Spear, I talked about how, like, you know, in Attica, they overthrew the prison regime to create some breathing space for them. And in that breathing space, that's where the productive aspects of the revolt happened, where they were able to build infrastructure for themselves. So this idea of creating breathing, and at the same time, the state is trying to create some breathing space where they can actually start to implement these programs and identify sort of collaborators to help them build their own kind of programs. So this is the dynamic that he's talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I just also noticed as I was like looking back through this like really funny, this kind of shit always shows up as like this. He's like makes this note about basically like, you know, Anglo-Saxons are the best.
Right. Yeah. No, dude is racist.
You know, yeah. In a slightly different sense, the idea of placing a personal obligation for helping to keep the peace on every adult male in the community has been a feature of English methods since Saxon times, right? So it's just like,
there's
like
another
just to remind you all.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, there's another Oppenheimer quote there.
Yep.
And that quote leads to I want to read what Oppenheimer's saying here.
I would love this because I read this and I was like, "Why the right or the CIA?" Like, what the hell?
It's a weird. It's not actually a good. It doesn't clearly reflect what Oppenheimer's saying here, and I think he's, like I said, I don't know what's up with this guy, but. So first of all, he's talking about the two Oppenheimer in the section that he's citing. He's talking about the two-war strategy or the other war. The other war is the name of that Rand report that we read. So he seems really tapped into the kind of like counterinsurgent zeitgeist, let's say. This is the larger quote from which Kitson is pulling. The liberal, and it's very relevant to what we're talking about. The liberal, in quotes, the liberal solution, that of attempting to combine these two strategies. Let me see. Do I need to read the? No, I'll just start here. I think it'll make sense. He's talking about the problem of counterinsurgency and the different approaches. The liberal solution, that of attempting to combine these two strategies, is inherently inconsistent because the use of military means is almost inevitably bound, in an urban situation particularly, to injure the innocent. And if the guerrillas really come from the local population, win them more support and thereby undermine the other war, that of reform measures. So the other war is reform. In addition, the two-war strategy, so in other words, he's talking about different ways that counterinsurgents can respond. One way is just through violence. The other way is through reform. And now he's talking about the possibility of the two-war strategy of calibrating violence and reform, which is what, to some extent, that's what they do all the time. So I don't fully understand what he's trying to do here. In addition, the two-war strategy is often dangerous because it elicits counter-revolutionary measures from the ultra-right, which is threatened by the reforms. The liberal way of coping with insurgency is similar in many ways to the moderate, in quotes, road to reform in the underdeveloped nation. The liberal or moderate is always caught on the horns of a power dilemma. If he does not promote enough reforms to deal with the society's problems realistically, the left insurgents will gain strength, sometimes making it more difficult to institute reforms because the social structure is increasingly undermined. If, on the other hand, the reforms are meaningful and the left is undermined, there is always a danger from the right or the CIA. Meaningful reforms threaten the status quo so much that it often sees a counter-revolutionary coup as preferable, leading, if successful, to further growth of the left insurgents, for their problems remain unsolved.
It's an interesting passage for sure.
Yeah, I don't, this is a weird book. It's a very weird book.
Well, it's funny too because the way that Kitson is then framing it as if the right and the CIA represent the majority opinion in society, basically,
exactly.
And so that's the part that's really funny. And he says the same thing. He goes on to have this little quote about Northern Ireland, which I think is somewhat interesting too. And we could actually pivot to a little bit of a discussion. I have a couple of things on Northern Ireland I can kind of bring in, but he says Northern Ireland affords another good example at the time of writing because certain sections of the unionist majority are trying to prevent their own government from giving concessions to the nationalist minority, which is true in some respects. However, like the whole project of Northern Ireland was to create a 6 counties within a 32 county, country in which you would have a narrow majority of, Protestants, of unionists, and so even painting the Republicans as the minority is fairly disingenuous because obviously a majority of people within the island of Ireland, were Republican, and so it's like that was a counterinsurgency tactic in and of itself, even the creation of Northern Ireland,
100%
as part of the United Kingdom.
He talks about some of this in that document, but that document is kind of long and it's hard to read. And I know we've been reading a lot, so I don't know if it makes sense to bring it up. But your point about how he in low intensity operations, he's making claims about what the majority and the minority want. But he superimposed that onto Oppenheimer's convoluted, for sure, but it was a conversation about politics, about left and right politics. Yes, that's an important point. It's very clear that for Kitson, the majority is aligned with the right wing and with the CIA. He said that is what he said, and that's fascinating.
All right, I'm going to kind of jump ahead a little bit. We can always go back to anything that you want, but so chapter 6 is on insurgency and the handling of information.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to actually take a quick break. I will be right back.
Okay.
All
right, no worries. All right. So I'll say a couple things in the meantime. So one thing that's interesting, I've been doing some different, I watched the series Say Nothing, which is an interesting series. It's on Hulu or FX. It's a dramatization of the book Say Nothing, which is based in large part around some oral histories that were done by IRA members, including Brendan Hughes, Dolores Price, and some others. There are some problems with the book and with the series, namely that it tends to focus a lot on some of the disappearances and trying to find somebody who's responsible for these disappearances, right? Which becomes a kind of anti-IRA, exercise in its own. And it also leaves out some things, or at least doesn't seriously take the IRA perspective on certain things related to these disappearances either. But having said that, those caveats aside, like, I think it's pretty good, and Kitson is a figure in it, so it's interesting too. They show some of Kitson's counterinsurgency tactics. One that they show is this one that he talks about in relation to the Mau Mau, that we'll probably talk about maybe a little bit. But one of the things that they would do is once they developed informants, right, they would cover them in sheets, and then they would take them into villages and they would identify people who were insurgents. The informants would, but because they were in sheets, nobody knew who they were. And on one level, like, Kitson has this piece even in the movie where he says, look, one of two things either happen with this kind of stuff. Like, we develop these informants, and either the insurgents kill the informants, you know, or they don't, and we get information. But if they kill the informants, it's good because it lessens their ranks and it turns them against each other, right? And so that's one thing. But I think also the sheet thing is, like, outdated. I mean, this is why there's like two-way mirrors in police stations and stuff like that, right? Like, police use these tactics all the time of trying to keep informants protected from, criminals, insurgents, whatever, right? And they also do these things always to kind of try to cause, insurgents to turn against their own ranks. So I was talking about the use of putting hoods on people, or putting sheets on people, which was something that they did with the Mau Mau. And it's also something that shows up in Say Nothing and is done in the context of Northern Ireland as well.
The one thing, I don't know how intentional this was, but they look like Ku Klux Klan sheets. Like, and
totally
people have made that remark before. So, and obviously this was in the 50s, so the Klan was a cultural phenomena. So I don't know how intentional that was. But the other reason why they all had sheets on was because there would be multiple people doing it at the same time, so they wouldn't be able to see each other. Mm-hmm. And so part of it was a method of what do you call it? Like quality control. Because you could just say no, 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 yes, yes, yes. But if 5 people say yes, that's a way of, like, okay, that person is an insurgent. So that was part of the rationale. But yeah, it was really weird.
Yeah, 100%. All right, I'm gonna pull to the top of 6 because he goes back to Mao, and it's just these people are obsessed with Mao. Like, all of them, all counterinsurgency writers are obsessed with Mao. I just think that's fascinating. All right. It also, I think, should tell people that we should take Mao as seriously as they do, at least. So he says, in the final phase of a revolutionary campaign as envisioned by Mao Zedong, armed insurgents come out into the open and fight the forces of the government by conventional methods. But in the earlier stages, the war is fought by people who strike at a time and place of their own choosing and then disappear. Sometimes their disturbance is achieved by the physical process of movement into an area of thick cover, such as a jungle, and at other times by merging into the population. In either case, sometimes their disappearance, not disturbance. That's an important thing to clarify. They disappear by going into the jungles, right, or the mountains, or amongst the people, which is also interesting because Cabral famously said, "Our people are our mountains," right? We don't have mountains. In either case, those who are supporting them by the provision of food, recruits, intelligence, and supplies rely for their security on remaining anonymous. The problem of destroying enemy armed groups and their supporters therefore consists very largely of finding them. Once found, they can no longer strike on their own terms, but are obliged to dance to the tune of the government's forces. It then becomes comparatively simple matter to dispose of them. Right. Again, the language of disposal or elimination. I'm not going to go heavily into this chapter because most of what this chapter is and most of what the back half of the book is, one is like him. Well, of this chapter, a lot of it is scenarios, right? And I think the scenarios are interesting. I think people would find them interesting to read. I think there's a lot of bullshit within them in terms of like how he's actually describing what went on. But he's talking about their strategies and he's talking about tactics that they developed. He uses campaign in Malaya. He uses Kenya. He uses a little bit of the Philippines. Like he mixes in, and he'll even say it. He's like, this part is based upon the counterinsurgency in the Philippines or in Kenya or whatever. But I think to me, it's like the strategies also that are maybe more important than the tactics sometimes, because the tactics can change, right? But their overall strategies seem to me to stay fairly consistent through the decades of like, what are we trying to do? They take different approaches to doing it, and it's interesting to look at those approaches. But also, like, the technology is very different, so it's like a book that was written about countering Hezbollah or Hamas probably has a lot more application today in terms of, because they're thinking about these issues of like technology and all of that, both sides of the struggle, right? And in this case, you're dealing with contexts where the technology was, I mean, in Kenya, for instance, like one of the problems was like they basically didn't have weapons. Like they had like basically small swords that they made often, and they had guns, about 20% of which could actually fire a bullet, and even in terms of getting ammunition, Sakai talks about this, like some of the women who were forced into prostitution by the colonial regime would make soldiers pay with a bullet in exchange for sex, right? And so this was how they could supply some ammunition to the insurgency or to the revolution, right? Was by getting bullets one by one in this way. So it just gives like, I just think it's interesting to read these things, but I didn't want to go through all of them today. We can pull out if you want to talk about any specific stuff that stood out in this section to you, but yeah.
No, I mean, that opening quote was really important. I think what you just said, I would say that what you just said in terms of they don't have any new strategies, I think that's true. And I don't think it just is the decades. I think it's like the centuries. Tactically, technologically, 100%. But overall, I mean, I think that's what's so important about the longer frame of pacification and tracing it all the way back to, whatever, the Roman Empire. Like, I don't think much has changed strategic in terms of the big picture, right? So strategy is the science of winning wars. Tactics is, or the art. Strategy is the art of winning wars. Strategy is the art of winning wars. Tactics is the art of winning all of the battles necessary to win the war. And I don't think strategically things have changed since like Sun Tzu, honestly, really. But yeah, so I think that's important. And so I think your approach to chapter 6 and the latter half of the book is spot on. We're in agreement.
The other thing that he does is he says, like, there's a big section of the book that's just advocating for more counterinsurgency curriculum. And he does talk about how the United States studies it a lot more than even in this time in 1971 than Great Britain was. But he's advocating for that. He also advocates for studying peacekeeping, which really is not, I mean, yeah. I mean, it's not even worth engaging, I don't think, to much a degree, other than he talks a little bit about what military peacekeeping, supposedly is, and how militaries don't like it because they're not supposed to be killing people and, that kind of stuff.
I mean, there is a part of the history that I haven't looked into as much, which is just the extent to which this text, it seems like this text was taken up by NATO. So I think that's an interesting, I agree with you that we don't need to engage it here, but that's an interesting part of the history.
Yeah. So I do think we should do a little more, though, just talking about two things, probably at least, which is this developing of information, because that's actually this section through these scenarios. This is kind of his argument, right? Is as he said with that Mao thing, is like, we got to find them, right? And so all the scenarios are basically, how did we find the insurgents in order to kill them? And how did we also, break up the coalition, of the insurgency? Like, how did we pit people against each other and get people to inform on each other and so on? I think some of the strategies he talks about that are important and are still definitely used, especially, so coordinating, right? Getting people, Gaza itself is this, like, the reason that Gaza is, as many people have called it, an open air prison or whatever else, is because it's been about coordinating this section of Palestinians completely out of the larger area geography of their land, so that they cannot, be an insurgent, force against this colonial imposition.
And the food control, which is such a big part of
Right.
it. Kitson talks about that, right? So like
Yep.
what do they call it in the humanitarian minimum, right? Like having a number of calories per person that they allow in to manage the population at a macro level. I mean, they were doing this in Kenya as well. Yeah.
100%. And then, so let's talk about counter gangs just a little bit more. So I'm just going to pull up, this is just a Wikipedia page, actually, just to give people, like, a very thumbnail thing. But one of the groups that Kitson is, responsible for starting is this group called the MRF in Ireland. And I'm trying to expand, but it won't let me. Oh, there we go. And the MRF, nobody actually really knows what it stands for. Like, sometimes it's called the Military Reaction Force, Military Reconnaissance Force, or Mobile Reconnaissance Force, or another iteration of this. Again, it was supposed to be an intelligence gathering, which I think, again, this is to the point about that you raised about what, this language of COINTELPRO and counterintelligence. Like, that is, on some level, I totally agree with your point. On another level, like, that is the way that they also talk about it, right? So it's like this whole section of Kitson's book is all about intelligence and all about information and improving the quality of information. And that sounds like such a, like, okay, what's the problem with them having information and developing it? This is, they're talking about learning, but in reality, what goes into that process is just always, like, transgresses any boundaries of what people think is sort of normal or allowable, and so the MRF was this example in Ireland. Let me see if I think I gotta put it back up there, hang on. And the unit, so it was a counterinsurgency unit of the British Army during the so-called Troubles. It was formed in the summer of 71, so it's like right around the time that this book is published. Operated through 73 probably. And this group, I think you have some articles about them too. There's a lot of cases against them. I mean, they killed people, right? Like, that's one of the things here. And they would kill people, and sometimes it would be like to make it seem like the IRA had done it, or to pit the provisional IRA against the original IRA, or to make it seem as if a loyalist militia had done it in order to get the IRA to respond in attack against, these unionist forces. And so there was a lot. It's like, it's a combination of a psyop, an intelligence gathering thing, what you would think of as like or agent provocateurs, like the COINTELPRO kind of stuff that we're talking about. All of those things are going on. And some of it, the MRF, like, you have to think about it a little more expansively than the way they're talking about it, because there is the British military element, but they're also colluding with the fascist militias, the right-wing militias in Ireland. There's, sometimes a flexible kind of membership, and like whether somebody's actually MRF, right, versus like, it's the counter gangs thing again. So it's the idea that you could have one military officer that's like agitating a group of people to do this action. You could have a small unit of military officers that are doing this stuff together, or some combination of all of this. And it's just to create really chaos and to try to cause the population to question, well, is the IRA doing this? Is cause people to just have more conflict. I mean, it's actually an interesting thing just because it, like, in some ways in Ireland, I think it had the wrong effect in terms of it actually heightened the conflict in certain degrees, because it 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 intensified the divisions to an extent where the military, but I think that's part of the point, is to like turn people against each other, right? Get people fighting each other. And I even think, like, this might be controversial for some folks, but people talk about it. But like the LA Panthers and the US organization stuff, like, was it a counter gang? Was it a pseudo gang? Was it somebody who was, I know there's books out there that say Karenga was on the payroll and this kind of stuff, like, so again, like, to draw an example within the United States, like that might be one, in which there's a couple of LA Panthers that get killed in the shootout that's basically hyped up, where these organizations go at each other, but anyways, I just wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit. I don't know if you have other stuff you want to add.
No, you said it. I mean, chaos, confusion, creating a situation that makes it really difficult for people to trust each other, not knowing that it's the not knowing. It's confusing. It undermines any kind of capacity to build organization. Kitson left Northern Ireland in like 72 or 71, 72, like before the troubles, the violence really intensified, right? But so much of it is then projected onto him. Maybe he came back, maybe he didn't, he gets, Sakai talks about how he is credited with the counter gang thing, but like, he's not even the dude who like developed it. It was that guy Holyoke or whatever. But even then, it has a much longer history. But that's not the point. Is just to create chaos. And the point also is that because these people are on the side of the state, that they have kind of carte blanche to just do whatever. And at the end, there's a section on like education. And I said this last time, he says, I think it all boils down to, it's about being devious. You know what I mean? So you can do whatever you want in a counter gang. There's, and there's no way to know it. And that's the most effective part, is our inability to actually really know what was going on, and how that gives rise to all kinds of speculation, some of which makes the enemy seem more powerful and more organized than they actually are, which is to their benefit.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, in the Ireland context, it's fascinating because some of the stuff that people know is because people who were in the MRF eventually confessed, you know, and yeah, and so there's that element too. I think one particular discussion, like somebody went and confessed in like a London, Scotland Yard or something like that, right? And so it was like, there's this historian who talks about it, and he's like, it would be one thing if they confessed in some court in Northern Ireland or police, who are kind of like in on it, but like you go and do it to Scotland Yard and people are like, whoa, wait a minute. And, because again, it's just you're in a different location, and the context is different. Northern Ireland is the colonial situation and has a kind of colonial managing apparatus, and they understand certain elements of this are going on.
But
yeah,
even with the confessions, though, do you know what I mean? It's like,
well, it's years later.
Later, and like I saw there was a comment on the last one about what's the guy's name? You talked about the LA Panthers. What's his name?
Karenga?
No. The agent who like outed everybody.
Oh, Tackwood, right? Louis Tackwood.
Yeah, Louis Tackwood, right? And just right. Like, so it's just hard to make sense of these things, and because there's this whole concept of like the limited hangout, right, as an intelligence strategy of like once an operation has been blown, you then you admit to it, but you admit to it in a way that actually conceals some of the most, that conceals the depth of it, right, as a way, a limited admission type of thing, right?
Yeah.
All I'm saying is that the intense distrust, suspicion, paranoia that's intentionally produced makes it so that even when someone comes forward and admits to something, there's going to be large amounts of people who don't even take that seriously or think that that's an op, and that's the part of it. That's the whole. It creates this whole environment. I think a lot about what Laura Shihai talks about in terms of like the psychic intrusion. And that's why I appreciate those conversations so much.
Yeah, and that point too, I mean, about Tackwood, like I think that was my response to that person was like, yes, he says this, he says a lot of things, and there's other folks who say things, but I mean, you and I both read the book Chaos, which I know there's now a Netflix series of, and I haven't seen that, so I don't know how
I started it, but I couldn't get very far. I'm not necessarily because it wasn't good. I was just like, I don't know if I can do this.
Yeah, but I mean, the book is a fascinating book because it's just like this kind of, I would call him just like a bourgeois journalist who just like goes down all these rabbit holes, and then he's like, he gets in this place of like, I don't know what to believe here. There's some crazy stuff going on here. Like the CIA might have been responsible for creating Charles Manson, and then I mean, he gets into the SLA and all this stuff, and I think that that's the kind of desired effect, is that even when you dig into it, and I mean, we could, the Kennedy documents that are coming out now, it's like there's so many things of like trying to get to the truth. Tackwood's an example where you can't necessarily take, if somebody's a snitch and they're like ratting out all this stuff, is that itself an op, right? Mm-hmm. Are they trying to bad jacket certain people, right? Or whatever, like, is that part of it as well? And there is some of that goes on. Kitson used to give interviews to newspaper people, and he would tell them lies, and they would print it, which is, I mean, it feels mundane to even explain because this goes on all the time, literally, right? Like, you interview state agents and you ask them what's going on. A lot of what they're doing is just propaganda, right? They're spreading some kind of message that they want. It may or may not be true at all, but they want that message to come across. And sometimes they want that message to come across because they think insurgents are reading it or other people are reading it, and they're trying to actually throw them off, right? Which this is the whole thing of psyops, which we probably didn't talk about enough. I mean, Kitson is just very, doesn't talk about a lot about what they are or what types. He just says we need a whole lot of infrastructure to do psyops. Like,
Yep.
you know.
And he says the Americans do it quite well.
Yeah, he does. He does say the Americans are way better and have more people doing it than we do. Yeah. All right. So let's see. Yeah, I mean, the only other thing, and I mentioned it and we talked about it, is, yeah, the big emphasis for him is on developing background information into contact information, which again is just sort of to say, even with all the information that people have now, because of things like social media, which they have access to all of that type of stuff, we should never assume that these people have more information than what they're letting on, or that they even know that what they're saying is true, right? And this is why people just shouldn't talk to them, you know, because they use trickery to try to get more information, to verify stuff, to get deeper information, and so on. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I have much else. Did you have something on, let's see, in the counter gangs, did you have anything else?
No, I mean, I think that's it. I think we exhausted that, and not in a bad way, but I mean, I think
right on.
I think we landed on the correct point, which is like we know all we can know, and at a certain point, the speculation about is it or isn't it, like, isn't helpful, and in fact plays into the whole process as a psychological warfare strategy. And part of what we have to do is to develop, I think about, Mao's essay on politics and how he talks about social practice as being the criteria for truth. And so part of what we have to do is to be able to be okay with the uncertainty and clear in our own historical mission, and understanding that the truth that we're aligned with is the truth that comes out of our collective social practice in what we're trying to build, our own ethics, our own values, and keep it moving. Because yeah, that's all.
I just want to bring this in. I appreciate all the stuff in the chat. There's been some great commentary. I haven't really been able to capture all of this, but I thought this was an interesting point. Shout out to Jackie Lukman too. That a movie like Judas and the Black Messiah, that one of the things it's doing is trying to build sympathy for traitors. And do we think that's also a tactic in these confessions? I think that's an interesting question. I do think that in general, that point about sort of building sympathy for traitors is a part of what they're doing. I mean, they not only that, but they want us to take the perspective of the people who would rat out Fred Hampton. That's ultimately why, in my view, that film is narrated in that way, is that even though there are things in that movie that I would say it does fairly well in terms of trying to allow you to sympathize also with Fred and to understand where he's coming from, and there's some great parts of that film. It's a very kind of sinister thing to tell it through the lens of the person who's really, implicated in his killing. And I mean, in some ways, it wants you to then turn your, see Hoover and see, I can't remember the name of the other FBI, the white FBI guy, see them as the real villains to some extent. But yeah, so it's just kind of like, I think, to create a sympathy of, well, yeah, he's just a guy who's caught up in a tough situation and he gets turned against this thing and he's, ends up being responsible for this. But I mean, I will say that is also how they operate too.
Yeah, it's true. That's true. But it's a narrative choice to focus on that as opposed to other things. But I gotta say, I mean, if the name of the movie was just The Black Messiah, I would be mad as hell about that too, because that's state language. Like
Mm-hmm.
Hampton wasn't walking around saying, "I'm the Black Messiah, I'm the chosen one." He was about the people, right? So that is a really specific way of thinking. Like the idea of the Black Messiah or of the Messiah, that is a counterinsurgent epistemology. This is what I'm saying. It's this idea that the people need an anointed, chosen figure to shepherd them into freedom, into a new kind of way of acting, into a new kind of a political whatever frame. And I don't think that that's how Fred saw himself. I think that's the way the FBI was reading the movement, and they were reading the movement through their own. They were reading the movement through counterinsurgency. So I would have a problem with that either way. But yes, I'm here for that critique as well.
Yeah. Leah, shout out to Leah. How do you think the state will use the declassification of the FBI files in their favor? I think one way is just that they control always what gets declassified and what does not. And so, but I also think, I mean, and this gets to another area, because I think both you and I are people who we kind of have this, we have a soft spot for conspiracies and for like, for that kind of stuff, consuming that kind of, reading material, movies and so on. But it's not actually, so I mean, we could talk about this, but and you've talked about it with us before. I mean, one, a conspiracy, as you say, is a fairly mundane thing, and perhaps we could talk about that a little bit. But also, I think conspiratorial thinking, so getting too invested in, I want to figure out like who the exact gunman is for this and who ordered that, that this actually like it doesn't actually, it's, for one, it's not a like Marxist kind of way of looking at things. It doesn't have you're looking constantly for a smoking gun that you're probably never going to find, and people devote decades of their lives to this kind of stuff, whereas like it just kind of obscures that there are larger power relations at play. And I mean, even is it really that important at the end of the day? Also, like, who killed JFK? Like, as people on the left, is that the most important? He was a member of the ruling class. He was a president. He did horrible things. He's somebody who I think has had a much longer legacy and been kind of upheld as this like great president in part because he was killed. And yeah, I'm sure bad people took him out, but and I say all this to say I'm also still always interested in stuff that comes out in these file dumps and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know your thoughts.
No, I largely agree. I mean, I think it's always fascinating how minor the revelations are when these things happen. It's like, oh, now we know a little bit more about this, right? It's never like, this idea that these things are written like that someone sat down and wrote a diary where they just said, okay, this is what I'm doing, and then I did this, and that there is a document somewhere where the truth is held. And that all that needs to happen is for it to be revealed, and then we will have access to the truth. I think like that's not going to happen. That's not how it works. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting to think about these files being declassified when we have a new kind of FBI domestic police state regime coming into being. So that's interesting. Yeah.
I also think one of the interesting things too, and I think you do this really well, is that people often go through these things looking for a specific thing, right? Like you said, they're looking for the diary that says I killed JFK and I was ordered to do it by, Mossad or the CIA or whatever else, right? And but there's always a lot of like mundane admissions within them too, which is I think what you do really well in terms of your reading of a lot of this stuff is to, I mean, like the Rand stuff is fascinating too. Like the amount of these documents that they're just like, yeah, we'll put this out for everybody to read, like because they're not actually. I mean, I'm sure that they have their own, secretive file stuff that is too sensitive for them to just allow, general members of the population to read. But the rest of it, they're like, yeah, like we're right. This is what we do is for a greater good and a higher aim. And so we don't mind telling you that this is how we plan to kill people and subvert their movements. Like,
yeah, they want us to know that. They want us to know this kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm sure we'll find another opportunity to have another discussion, hopefully not hopefully not too far in the future. This has been, really fun and interesting, and been an honor to have this conversation with you. Is there anything else you want to say as we wrap up?
Nah, man, this was great. I'm glad we finally got a chance to do this. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah. Now want to tell one more story. Shoot, I should have done this earlier. But so back to Say Nothing, there's this other interesting scene, and I think there's an interesting kind of tactical like back and forth in that series. And one of the tactics that Kitson uses to develop background information into contact information, I wouldn't even call it that, but information gathering, is that he infiltrates and basically gets control of the laundry service that serves Devis Flats in Northern Ireland, where there's a high population of Republicans. And so he gets all their clothes as they're being washed, and he has them all tested for residues, bomb residues, gunpowder, etc. But connected to this, as this is going on, the IRA discover, I can't remember how, but they discover that a couple of their people are informing, that Kitson has turned them. And, and the impulse in the series, the impulse, I believe Jerry Adams' impulse, and again, Jerry Adams has never admitted that he was even in the provisional IRA, but in the series, the impulse is to kill them, the people who are informing. And Brendan Hughes, who I had a conversation with that we put out, a conversation about his writings that we put out this week on the audio side, but he basically is like, no, like we shouldn't, because we can use them, and so then they become basically triple agents, right? Because they're in the IRA, they're informing for Kitson, and now the IRA knows that they're doing this, and so it then uses that, turns them against the Kitson's forces again. And so they do this to actually, like, one of the things that they uncover by doing this is this laundry operation, which then they ambush. Basically, the IRA, ambushes this laundry operation and ends up, I think, killing one of the people who is an MRF member or a member of the British, counterinsurgency forces there, and one of them ends up escaping. But it's just also an interesting thing too of these. It's one of the parts I appreciated most about the series is this kind of tactical tete-a-tete between these forces of like, they're. And I think it actually proposes something interesting with regard to the IRA, which is sort of like maybe in certain instances, getting rid of the person who's the informant is not necessarily the right thing to do. I mean, there's the ethical and moral question, but there's also this tactical question that Brendan brings up, which is just like, no, these people are now inside their thing, so they could feed misinformation to the counterinsurgents. but we can also use them to gather information on what they're doing and subvert their tactics as well. So, it's just an interesting thing. It's a whole nother.
Yeah, there are many stories to be told about the amount of assets people in the liberation movements of the 60s and 70s were able to develop.
Yeah.
Within the state and elsewhere. Yeah.
Chitty Matcha, this is the theory I agree with the most on JFK. Just for the record, is that his assassination was orchestrated by Allen Dulles at the behest of the Rockefellers. An interesting book to that effect, if people want to read it, is Devil's Chessboard by I think David Talbot, which goes, it's amazing the amount of information in that book about the Kennedys and about the Rockefellers and everything else. And but yeah, there's a lot of theories. I have no idea ultimately, but that one's very interesting at least. Yeah. All right, man. I won't keep you longer. This has been great. Thanks everybody. This was fun. Have a good I should say a couple of things coming up. So Sunday, I'm waiting for a little bit of information, but we're gonna have a conversation on the Congo with some folks from BAP on Sunday, I think at 8 p.m. And then on Tuesday, Mtume Gant's going to be back, and we are going to talk about the final section of Cedric Robinson's Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, which is like 120 pages or something like that. Those chapters are huge. Anyways, all right. Have a good one. Peace out, everybody.
Peace.